Hi. Sorry, I'm starting a little bit late, having AV difficulties. The OWL camera that the system saw and was willing to work with just fine the first two sessions, the system's decided now it doesn't recognize that camera. So it took me a while to accept the inevitable. Someone has to have the joke for the day. Who's brave? I can call on you. Ah, excellent. Hold on. We don't want anyone to miss it.
All right, I have a pickup line. Is that a mirror in your pocket? Because I can see myself in your pants.
Okay, nice reversal. Yeah, not what I was expecting. Excellent. Yeah. Abder, yeah. Uh-oh. That's right. Yeah, they have to remind me that they told a joke already. Hopefully it's one that's memorable. I don't actually I'm terrible at remembering any of them, so I won't have the criterion. Okay, yeah. Am I keeping track of everyone who's it's a mystery. Yeah.
Can a person say more than one joke per question?
I mean, unless people, as should happen, unless people are fighting to who's going to tell the joke today. Yes, you are allowed to tell more than one joke. No, there's no extra credit. I mean, except in heaven. Yeah. Azi, what? Zahi, yeah. What was the question? Excellent question. What's the role of deception in classrooms and in mating systems? We're going to talk about that today. And we're all going to keep an eye on you now. Yeah, okay. Well, so you said, but you didn't raise your hand. So I don't, yeah, okay. So we've been talking about, a couple of announcements. One, several people have asked about an honors option. And so on D2L now I've posted some instructions about honors option. We'll talk about it another time. I'm already feeling a little behind today. Number two, someone pointed out to me, remember the 1066 lecture where after the Norman invasion, William the Conqueror and his gang, they all spoke French and all the common people spoke English. Someone pointed out to me another aspect of that fact that all the commoners, all the peasants are speaking German and all the nobles are speaking French. And there's a leftover of that in our language today, which is this. Have you ever noticed that cattle, the meat that comes from cattle is called beef? Cattle's the Saxon word. Beef is the French word. Swine, pigs, that's pork. So what was going on then is all the poor people had to take care of the cattle, right? They had nothing else to do. But once they prepared cattle or pork or whatever and sent it up to the manor, the people there referred to it by a different name. Questions? If you haven't noticed, social class has always been with us. My particular bugaboo. Okay, any questions about any of that or about anything in the course? So we were talking about sexual reproduction and the fact that what makes sexual reproduction so incredibly productive in terms of generating diversity is that at the phase of meiosis, that kind of division that's important for making gametes, at that phase where each of the daughter cells is going to get only a single set of the chromosomes, so each daughter cell is going to be haploid, even though the mother cell was diploid, that in making those haploid cells during meiosis, an important thing happens, which is the homologous pairs of chromosomes start swapping bits back and forth, so that you end up with this rich recombination, so that every gamete has a unique set of that individual's genes. And think about that a little bit more. Each gamete, let's say it's a woman, each egg she makes has a unique mixture of genes, some of which came from her mother and some of which came from her father. Right? And that's going to be important when we talk about why bother reproducing sexually when you could double your input to the next, your genetic contribution to the next generation by just cloning yourself. So far, so good. And we got as far as talking about paternity tests. And it turns out that as long as people have been alive, men have worried about whether that kid's their father. And I'll give you a little terminology lesson. The cuckoo, we don't have them here, but they're very common in Europe. And they make that weird sound that cuckoo clocks can imitate, et cetera. But the other thing that's prominent about cuckoos is they are nest parasites. They don't raise their young. They mate, the female finds a nest somewhere of some bird and waits until it's unoccupied. Then she goes and lays her egg in that nest. And when it hatches, those parents will feed that offspring that's no relation to them. Often, when the egg hatches, one of the first things it does is start pushing out the sides to push out of the nest any eggs that aren't it, right? Everyone get the idea? So the cuckoo's offspring are raised by somebody else. And so the name, Old English name, for a man whose wife is bearing somebody else's child is a cuckold. And if that happened to you, if your wife had a child and it's fathered by somebody else, you've been cuckolded. How many people knew that already? Okay, Shakespeare fans, yep. And so it turns out, well before Shakespeare, men worried about whether that child was theirs or had actually been fathered by somebody else. In other words, had their wife had sex with somebody else. And in fact, it's pretty interesting how widespread this suspicion and concern is. It makes up millions of jokes. It's definitely weaved into our culture that this is what women do, right? They make you raise the kid, but in fact, they were having sex with somebody else, right? In fact, it's exceedingly rare. It probably, in a general population, it probably happens about 5% of the time, right? So in other words, 95% of births are fathered by the person, you know, that's supposed to be the father. In those days, in the old days, the husband. On the other hand, I think I pointed out to you that if you look at that subset of men who are so worried about who fathered that kid, that they look for a paternity test, you can, you know, the proportion of those that are in fact outside marriage is much greater, like 30%. But still, even there, the majority of the time, the suspicious father is full of crap. It's his kid. And you might spend some time thinking about how come, you know, if in fact most women are so sexually faithful, how come our society doesn't think so, right? And for paternity tests, this is the old-fashioned kind, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how they work. For a paternity test to work, there has to be a DNA sample from the mother, as well as the child and the father. And what that means is, the reason you need something from the mother is if this is the offspring, and they have a band here, you need to know whether it could have come from, oh, and how do these work? You take the DNA, you take samples, blood, you spin it down, you pull out the cells, you rupture the cells, you purify for DNA and throw away the RNA and the protein, so you got a bunch of DNA, and then you expose it to a particular set of digestive enzymes that snip DNA at very specific places in terms of the nucleotide sequence in that area. And you don't need to care how they do it. Just that because the enzymes are very selective, they'll treat every piece of DNA from a given donor exactly the same way and cut it in the same place. And when you're done then, you take the sample from everybody and you put it in a well above some gelatin, and then you set an electric charge to pull the samples from the well down the grid, down the gel. And basically, big chunks of DNA take longer, and small chunks of DNA go faster. So after a certain amount of time, you look, and here's mom, and the digestive enzymes ended up with this particular pattern of chunks of her DNA. So far, so good? Get the idea? And here's her offspring, who also has their own chunks, and they're not exactly the same. But if you look at this chunk here, right, it matches the mother, and so for all we know, that came from mom. Likewise, this chunk and that chunk, this chunk and that chunk. Everyone get the idea, the logic of it? On the other hand, Junior has this band, and mom doesn't, so it had to come from the dad. And what do you think? Did it come from this father or this father? Well, apparently it came from this father. Or here's, let's see, where's the other example? Here's another example. I suppose that's supposed to be all the way down. Or here's another example. Junior's got this, so does this father, but that father doesn't. Everyone got the logic of that? Notice that if the two fathers happen to be monozygotic twins, you're not going to be able to tell them apart this way. On the other hand, these days there are more refined techniques. I don't know if anyone, how often this comes up, but there are more refined techniques, can even tell those apart, but that's beyond this course. Questions about that? How that works? So if all you know is dad's DNA and the kid's DNA, you can't do the test. Well, I mean, you can, but not this way. And it gets more complicated. So far? Okay? Okay, bless you. And nest parasites, we don't have cuckoos around here. By the way, I was actually in Europe last year in Scotland, and it's amazing. They sound just like the clock. I mean, it's, I had to look around to make sure there wasn't a cuckoo clock going on somewhere. And it turns out the Bavarians figured out how to make a mechanical device that would make exactly that sound, and so that's where they came from. But here in the United States, and in the eastern United States, you will sometimes see on this campus a bird like this, where the females are relatively nondescript and the males are shinier. More about that later. And the male, this is a cowbird, and the male cowbird has a very sheeny black body with a brown head. So pretty distinctive. If you see one, you'll know it. And I have seen this, I didn't take these pictures, but I have seen this scene on campus more than once. In the spring, you'll hear some chirp, 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 the begging calls of chicks, which are all pretty much the same. And you'll look and you'll see a cardinal land somewhere, looking around kind of nervously, and then this big bird will stop next to it that's clearly not a cardinal and beg for food, and sometimes the male will feed it, right? So the bird's bigger than dad, or the presumed dad, and yet it's still begging for food. And for all birds, even if it's your own offspring, there comes a point when the adults get less and less, more and more resistant to the idea of feeding this thing because they've got other fish to fry. But you can look for this on campus. You'll see it sometime. Okay. And we'll return to this theme later. One of the things this tells us is nature is not where you go to look for moral behavior. Natural selection does not select for ethical or moral behavior. You cannot look to nature to decide what you ought to do. More about that soon. And there I told you all that stuff. Questions about that? So I want to get back to the question of why bother with sexual reproduction? And I put it this way a couple of times now. If you're thinking that natural selection favors individuals who contribute the most of their genes to future generations, then if an individual has a way of reproducing without sex, making offspring that are simple clones, have every one of their genes. Notice that every offspring produced in that way has twice as many of your genes to put into the next generation. And so why doesn't it happen more? So if you are a vertebrate and you reproduce offspring that are simply clones of yourself, that process is known as parthenogenesis. The Parthenon, right, is dedicated to the virgin goddess. So parthenogenesis means virgin birth. And it has been well documented in lots of different vertebrate species. And we'll talk some more about that later. But if you can just reproduce yourself, why not do that? Every offspring will be really, really related to you. They'll be your clones. The other creatures around here that you've seen are lots of invertebrates can reproduce through parthenogenesis. And around here, the creatures you've likely seen if you pay any attention to gardens are aphids, also known as green flies or black flies sometimes. In the States, they tend to be called aphids. These are the little green bugs that are eating your roses, right? And they can either reproduce sexually or through parthenogenesis. So what will sometimes happen if feeding's going really, really well, an aphid may be busy sucking juice out of the stem of the plant she's eating, and at the same time will squeeze out of her butt a daughter, and guess what? She's already got an embryo gestating inside her, and they're all genetically identical to each other. So they have the option of reproducing sexually or asexually. And here's just a graph to show you the benefits of this. If you're reproducing through parthenogenesis asexually, every descendant has all of your genes, whereas when you reproduce sexually, at each generation, the offspring only have half as many of your genes as the one before. Get that? And so if there are genes that favor maximizing contribution to the future gene pool, those genes should be favoring asexual reproduction, including parthenogenesis. How's that? Yeah, Abner.
Y chromosome is only passed down from father to grandfather to father. It's pretty much the same.
Well, so for those species that reproduce where sex determination is through chromosomes, it will be one sex or the other that will have two identical chromosomes, and the other sex will have two different ones. In mammals, it tends to be females who have the identical chromosome, the X, mammals and fruit flies, although that's just a coincidence. Whereas in birds, it's the males who have two sex chromosomes that are the same, right? So for purposes of this discussion, that's not really an issue because there are plenty of species where there are no sex chromosomes. We'll talk later about, well, how come they're not all one sex to the other, more later. And, but you are right that the X chromosome has thousands of genes and the Y chromosome only has about 100 that are actually functional. But they're important, right? Most of them, if they don't work, either the male won't develop or they'll be infertile. Yeah. Growing a human via bone marrow? Yeah, I mean, that's See, you should ask about that in neural development, the other course. Yes, I mean, if that isn't possible now, it probably will be. And well, yes, yeah. Again, when things work well. And let me ask, but if the offspring, if things don't go well, and the offspring's born with lots of malformations, who's responsible for that? Oh, do you just say, oh, well, it was just me anyway. I get to throw it away? Your opinion is a person, well, yeah. So I don't want to have that discussion now. I just want you to think about that. And if you haven't already. And it also eventually there are going to be people made that have three different parents, right? That all that can be done. There are no stupid questions. No, it's a great question. Well, number one, you have to, yeah, why not? Yeah, you got to put it in an egg, and you got to put that in a uterus and all that. But yeah, I can't see a reason not to, because this is a somatic, right? You're grabbing a diploid cell and taking its DNA and sticking it in there. I don't think that's been done, and it would probably be trickier. I don't even know if it's been done in mice where these things are, but sooner or later it will. Justin? Yep. So you can, yes, exactly, right. Where it's one woman's mitochondria, another woman's chromosomes, and of course, a man's chromosomes. Okay, good questions. Sorry, you'll have to work harder if you want to ask a question. So far, you're batting zero. So lots of different things have been offered as explanations for why sexual reproduction, at least some of the time, can be a really good thing. And there's several classes of this. And all of them boil down to what happens, that recombination. So it's interesting to notice when aphids reproduce asexually. When food is plentiful and predators are scarce, no ladybugs around, they tend to reproduce asexually, parthenogenesis. But when times get tough and they have to start flying around looking for new places to feed, then they tend to get together with other aphids and swap gametes. So for all the world, as though if everything's going great, why not clone yourself? But if times are tough, it may be time to hedge your bets. More about this later. And so one of the things sexual reproduction does is that recombination. One of the things it does is all of us are carrying mutations that are not beneficial, that are deleterious. And, right, we've all got some. And sexually reproducing over time tends to get rid of those deleterious mutations. And likewise, it may be that even if you don't have a beneficial mutation, it may be somebody else in the population has a beneficial mutation that's just great, that works fabulously, right? Suddenly you got X-ray vision or something, who knows? And in that case, if you don't reproduce sexually, your offspring will never benefit from that. So another thing that makes sexual reproduction a good idea is this bringing together of beneficial mutations. Everyone okay with that? And I think I pointed that out to you last time. You won the lottery in so many ways. You are incredible that you even exist, right? Because even though 10% of the population is infertile, every one of your thousands of ancestors, every one of them managed to reproduce. Plus, you represent today a combination of genes, many of which are beneficial, must be pretty beneficial. Here you are, doing well so far, right? Smart, etc. And almost all those beneficial mutations first arose in somebody else. So the 10 to 30,000 genes you have, let's assume that at least one copy, at least one allele of each one of them is good enough. So every one of those good enough genes arose in a different person. Because a new beneficial mutation, there's no way two of them are going to happen in the same individual. And so this is why you can see that sexual reproduction is such a marvelous driver of evolution, because it generates diversity in the population, and then natural selection is going to decide which of those individuals reproduce more, and that's going to get rid of bad mutations and perpetuate beneficial ones. Another explanation that's been offered is that we are all in a perpetual arms race. As you know from the COVID pandemic, you're old enough to remember, right? There was an incredible arms race going on where a virus got a new mutation that suddenly could infect people and could kill them. And it spread so fast that there was no chance for us to generate through selection to accumulate people who's had the genes that meant they have a mild case instead of a bad one. On the other hand, in 1918, the previous pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, it killed millions of people around the world. And within a few generations, it stopped being that deadly, right? And so that was selection at work. We didn't decide, we let all the people who are especially susceptible to Spanish flu, we let them, everyone die. Didn't have a choice. And they did not contribute their susceptibility to that particular flu to their offspring. What was really weird about the 1918 pandemic, by the way, is unlike the COVID pandemic, the Spanish flu virus tended to hit young adults. And so many children survived it and many old people survived it. And that's an unusual pattern. It has been thought that it may be that the older people survived it because they were more likely to have been exposed to a relative. And therefore, their immune systems might have been on top of that. So the other aspect of that is that our immune systems are incredibly adaptive and adaptable and can eventually fight just about any microbe that's been made, right? And that arms race is going on all the time. So here's some illustrations of that. Here, first, how you get rid of harmful mutations. It's just to graphically show what I'm talking about is if each of the X's is a bad mutation, when you reproduce asexually, every one of them is going to be there. Whereas when you reproduce sexually, at least some of the offspring won't have all those harmful mutations. And therefore, you have fewer children. You're only going to have, or you have less contribution in the next gene pool, 4 individuals, half of them being yours. So you only have 4 children, but one of those children might have 100 grandchildren. And over time, natural selection is going to favor that sort of reproduction, sexual reproduction, because it gets rid of harmful mutations. The specific idea that populations are in a constant arms race against microbes and parasites was first clearly articulated in 1994 by a guy named, I think, Matthew Ridley, and he called it the Red Queen hypothesis in honor of, I forget, Alice in Wonderland or maybe Through the Looking Glass. One of the Alice books where where someone says, the Red Queen says, it takes all the running you can do just to stay in the same place. And the idea is populations of animals they're constantly fighting against parasites and the like. And the population has to keep changing its genetic makeup in order to stay ahead of parasites, because the parasites are also being selected for. Among the parasites, those that are able to get into your immune system, they tend to reproduce more than those that can't. And there's pretty strong evidence that this is what's going on all the time. And so by reproducing sexually, you make sure that your future contributions to the gene pool, if not this time, you make sure that they have a better chance of being there. Because one of those combinations might keep your offspring, your descendants, from being quite so susceptible to whatever out there, roundworms, tapeworms, etc. Because on your body right now, the surface of your body is covered with parasites, mites that live in your eyelash hairs. And you're staying ahead of them. Your immune system and your defenses mostly stay ahead of it. But believe me, they're being selected for, and if a mutation arises in one of those, where suddenly they're much more offensive and harmful and successful, that's going to spread. How is that? And the most malicious parasites, of course, are those that make you sick but don't quite kill you. They stick around long enough for you to reproduce and give them more carriers that are, genetically susceptible. How's that? And the other obvious place where there's an arms race is in the concerns about antibiotics. So antibiotics in general are compounds that, for the most part, were found in nature, where one species or not other found that a particular kind of compound made it hard for bacteria or viruses to replicate. Everyone get that? And in 1940, when penicillin was discovered, it probably helped decide the outcome of World War II, and it saved thousands of lives. In the meantime, it saved millions of lives, because penicillin, for a wide range of bacteria, it's effective at keeping them from reproducing, either because it interferes with their DNA synthesis or with their protein synthesis. And in doing that, the person's immune system has a chance to get on top of it, and they might live. But the microbes that are out there are evolving in a world where there's loads of antibiotics already. And so those that are especially susceptible to antibiotics are not reproducing as much as those that have some resistance to it. And every once in a while, a mutation comes up so that they're more resistant to it. So again, in a world where if you pretend that these antibiotics are some cool mutation that one of us came up with that gave them some, benefit, you can see how, however beneficial it was, over time it stops working because the microbes are being selected for too. Too confusing? That's okay? Okay. So, and yet there are thousands of animal species, including hundreds of vertebrate species, where they don't reproduce with sexually. There are, for example, the most famous ones are these Nematophorus uniparens. The species name comes from the fact that there's only one parent for every individual in the population. They occur out in the southwest of the United States, in the deserts, and there are no males in this population. Men who need them, nobody. So every offspring is a clone of its mother. And it's clear they've been out there for a long time already. And what's interesting, and is being shown here, is that even though there's been no swapping of gametes for thousands of generations, males and females, females, when you put a pair of females together, often they show pseudo-mating behavior, where one will act like a male, grabbing the female on the thigh and wrapping their genitalia against the other female's genitalia. Nothing's happening, except that when a female has another female do that for her, then the female who's getting mated will produce more eggs and therefore more offspring. Yeah. Well, I mean, excellent question, because the only gamete they make are huge, right? They're eggs. So they're females because they make big gametes. Could there be a population? Let's assume that could there be a population where only small gametes are made? Every individual makes only small gametes? Nah. See, that too is developmental neurobiology. You need to understand, no, the egg brings so many resources. 2 sperm put together, I mean, there won't be anything to nurture the thing so it can go through 1 division, or maybe 1 or 2, and that's the end of it. No more proteins, no more directions, etc. So it really is males who are dispensable, not females. And we don't know how, the theory is that these whiptail lizards, the uniparens, that they resulted from a hybrid of 2 other species that are still out there, and that, you know, the hybrids couldn't reproduce sexually, but they could reproduce parthenogenically, and they've just done well enough. We don't know how long it's been going on, probably quite a while. But there are lots of vertebrate species that have been found like this, and the big question always is, how long have they been around? Have they been around 100 years? I mean, the only way we have to know is who's been collecting specimens, right? So it could be that each one of them is a flash in the pan. They're here for a while, and then something goes bad, and they're gone. And maybe eventually somebody will actually document a parthenogenically reproducing vertebrate species going extinct. However, among invertebrates, there are loads that reproduce asexually, not just unicellular organisms, metazoans, but not just unicellular organisms. But here's a famous example, the Deloid rotifer, which is a multicellular organism found in pond water, et cetera. Wherever you've been, if there's pond water in there, there are rotifers there. And I'm not going to go over the details, but the evidence is that they've been reproducing only asexually for millions of years. How do they do it? What is it? What's special about them that they never spread beneficial mutations, never get rid of bad mutations, and yet they persist? And the answer is nobody knows. You can read about these animals and others in a book that's, you know, not new anymore, but is still just as relevant and also pretty hilarious. This book, Dr. Tatiana's Sex Advice for All Creation, where the conceit is that various members of the animal species write to Dr. Tatiana and say, here's my problem. I, really want to get a male. I'm a robber fly, and I really want to make sure my offspring are going to do well. And I kind of like this one male, but he brings me tiny little food items. And the other male brings me huge food items, but he's really ugly. What should I do? You get the idea. I made that up, but whatever it is. And in the process, you end up learning an awful lot of biology. Here are the aphids I talked to you about who can reproduce. So here's a black version, and these are all mama's little cones following her around. And the other thing that keeps happening is we learn that other vertebrate species can reproduce parthenogenetically, but we only find out when humans are raising them. So it's been known for a long time that occasionally, not often, chickens and turkeys will lay an egg. There's no rooster or tom turkey anywhere, and sometimes the eggs hatch. And it's just a clone of mom, right? So it's not that there's something about being a vertebrate that makes it impossible for the cell biology to reproduce a clone of yourself, right? Occasionally, females in these species make eggs like that. Likewise, in zoos, right? And aquariums. So it's that way that people realize that Komodo dragons, huge vertebrate, can sometimes reproduce asexually because the zoo had the Komodo dragon for decades and there's been no males around, and suddenly she lays an egg and it hatches. Likewise, California condors and epaulet sharks, other examples. You okay? But just because you're going to reproduce sexually, that doesn't mean you have to swap gametes with somebody else. There are many species on Earth, mostly invertebrates, that are hermaphrodites, where they produce both sperm and eggs. In some of those species, they produce sperm and eggs at the same time. And in some of those species, they can fertilize themselves. So the term is hermaphrodites because they're a mixture of a male god and a female god, bless you. And there are lots of species where every individual is a hermaphrodite. And there are some species where some individuals are hermaphrodites. Among the vertebrates, the most prominent ones are among the fish. There are lots of fish species where at one point in their life, they're one sex and they reproduce that way. And in another time in their life, they turn into the other sex and they reproduce that way. So in the fish species, sometimes it's said to be sequential, where they spend typically the first part of the life as females. And then as they grow older and bigger, they switch to becoming males. But there are other species where they're not sequential hermaphrodites, they're opportunistic hermaphrodites. So aquarium fanciers have known for a long time that certain species of fish where if you take out all the males, eventually one of the females transforms her body and becomes a male and starts inseminating the other females. Jessica. Pardon? Melissa, sorry, yeah. Thank you for correcting me. Right. So there are some that are producing at the same time. That would be a simultaneous hermaphrodite. But there are other species that are sequential hermaphrodites. At one point in their lives, they're one sex, and the other, they're another. And there are loads of invertebrates where all their lives they produce both kinds of gametes. And not all, but many of them can fertilize themselves. So here's some hermaphroditic invertebrates swapping gametes. And we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about sexual differentiation. But I need to point out to you that no one has ever recorded a human hermaphrodite, that is, a human who is capable of reproducing both as a male and a female. You will sometimes hear that term applied incorrectly to some individuals who have some male traits and some female traits. So you will see or hear people refer to such individuals as hermaphrodites, but none of them are true hermaphrodites. And for a while, medical professionals might refer to them as pseudo-hermaphrodites, but it turns out nobody wants to be a pseudo anything, and that's kind of considered offensive. And so these days, the appropriate term is to refer to such individuals as being intersex, because they've got some male features and some female features. And so these individuals have been known for a long time, and we know from ancient art that ancient civilizations revered such individuals. They were seen as incredibly special. Sometimes they were thought to be seers that could tell the future, and et cetera. And these individuals in those societies, they had it made because everything about them was going to be taken care of. And so, for example, here's an ancient statue showing such an individual. Here's another. Not just that this person with breasts and has a penis, but that the penis can be erect. And here's yet another. And in all these cases, it's pretty clear that those individuals were highly regarded. But none of them ever reproduced as both a male and a female. We'll explain it later. In most of these cases, some of these individuals did reproduce, but typically as a male. And I'll explain to you why that is in sexual differentiation. Pardon? I don't think that there has been any mammalian species that are true hermaphrodites, correct. So maybe there's something about mammalian reproduction that makes that trickier than for reptiles and fish. So, So here's a classification of ways species can reproduce. They can reproduce asexually, unicellular animals, of course, right? They just split in two. Although there are unicellular animals that also reproduce sexually. And then there's parthenogenesis. In some cases, it's obligatory for whiptail lizards and these Amazon mollies that are pretty common in aquaria. And some that are occasional, like aphids. Or you can reproduce sexually. And if you reproduce sexually in some species, every individual is hermaphrodite, sometimes simultaneously and sometimes serially or sequentially. And then there are other species where they reproduce only sexually, and every individual has to be either male or female. And of those species that are separate sexes, as we'll see later, in some species, every individual is a male or a female, but they're not easy to tell apart. I never had a chance to be a good birder because going out looking at gulls, for example, I never had any idea which was the male, which was the female. And I've been with birders where, not only is that a female herring gull, but it's a second year, my failure. And lots of species where the two sexes are so different from one another that they're easy to tell apart from a distance. And we say that those are sexually dimorphic species, and we'll talk about that more later. The typical example is our lions, African lions, where the male has a mane that the female does not. So far? So where did males and females come from? And evolutionary thinkers think they understand how this came about. For aquatic species, right, where there's no copulation going on, you make your gametes and you release them into the water. And your gamete bumps into somebody else's gamete and they fuse. Now you've got a diploid individual again and starts dividing and makes a child for you both. But people noticed or theorized there may be a time in which the early animal species were isogametic, where the two gametes were the same size. So just make your gametes and send them out there. And notice there's variation everywhere in biology. So for isogametic species, there must have been, some variation in how big that gamete was. And in terms of natural selection, you can see in that sort of situation, if you happen to make gametes that were just a little bit smaller than the average, you could produce more of them. And therefore, you might have more offspring in the next generation. And they would fuse with another gamete, and if it was a normal size, then the fertilized egg, the zygote, would benefit from that other gamete's resources, which is important. because the offspring has no chance without those resources. Pardon? Exactly. Great question. So you could imagine that some individuals might have started trying to cheat by making slightly smaller gametes, but there reaches a point where if you make it too small, right, the fused egg won't have enough. In that sort of a situation, though, the animals we now call females, they're in a tough bind. That means if there are lots of medium-sized gametes out there, you might want to make yours bigger, because then if it gets fused, it's more likely to survive. Whereas if you make smaller ones, or the ones that were the size you had before, the offspring might not have enough resources to make it. And so the idea is there was an arms race where some individuals started making only small gametes. Okay, they're all small, but I can make twice as many of them. And as long as they run into a gamete that isn't cheating like me, they'll survive. And as that keeps happening generation after generation, then eventually you reach a situation where some individuals are making huge gametes because for all they know, they're going to get fertilized by one of those cheaters, right? You make a medium-sized gamete and a tiny gamete fuses with it, that was a waste of your resources. That won't survive. So what happened then is this arms race continued so that you ended up with enormous anisogamy, where the gametes are different sizes. And that's the situation we have today in sexually reproducing animals. Eventually, notice that this is also true as an individual. A hermaphrodite has to decide how many eggs am I going to release into the water and how many sperm. I can make a lot more of the sperm. They don't take as much energy or resources per gamete. But I want each one of my eggs to make it. Because for all I know, it's going to get fused by a tiny gamete, which we now call sperm, and that's my only chance of reproducing. So this is how it is, and I don't know of any species on Earth where every individual produces only a medium-sized gamete. That appears to be a dead end, right? Every species that sexually reproduces, every species of animal that sexually reproduces that I know of, the gametes come in two sizes, and there's no overlap in their sizes. The tiniest egg is huge compared to the biggest sperm. So that you end up in this situation where, in fact, the sperm is contributing no resources at all, only the DNA. Sperm are naked little gametes, naked little chunks of DNA that are totally helpless and have no chance of ever making an individual unless they fuse with a big gamete. Ethan. What are the benefits of having, it's a great question. We'll talk about it some more in a moment. But in general, it's this. Once you're in an economy where big eggs are likely to succeed, then you can't make as many of those gametes, but every one of them is going to find some sperm that wants to be there. And so what we'll see is, in general, when you make daughters, they are much more likely to reproduce than sons. It's not that simple, because in most mammalian populations, but let's look at mammals. In most mammalian populations in the wild, most of the males who are born, first of all, most of the males born never reach reproductive age. That's true for all the animals. And most of the males who reach reproductive age never reproduce even once. Most of them never even get to mate once. In rodent species out there, pretty well documented, most of the males that reach reproductive age, no one will ever copulate with them, not even once. So but females in populations out there, every female you trap, is either pregnant or lactating or both. So when you're putting genetic eggs into a basket, a daughter is a sure thing. And so why make sons? Well, because every once in a while, a son hits the jackpot for you. Genghis Khan's father, that Y chromosome, is now found in 8% of the people living in Asia. Right? Genghis and his brother, when they conquered places, it was really important for them to copulate with lots of virgins, right? Which you get to do when you kill people if they don't do it. And there's the result. So if you know you can produce a son and he's going to be another Genghis, go for it, right? That's the smart move. But who knows that, right? Okay. So that brings the question of how come everyone doesn't make sons or everyone doesn't make daughters? And within populations, it's probably an ongoing dynamic where once sons become rare, then their odds of contributing go up. And likewise, if daughters become too rare, if daughters become, they never become too rare, but if you run out of daughters, right, that's going to have a big impact on the population, and et cetera. And in those situations, it's better to have your daughters. And of course, some Asian cultures are dealing with this right now, where the preference for having sons has become so predominant that that it's now a buyer's market, where there are more men out there than can ever possibly get mates. And we'll talk about that some more later. In general, if you don't mess with things, it's pretty interesting that it's been looked at a lot of times. Human births at birth, about 51% of the live births are male and 49% female. There are these elaborate calendars that we put in, like when was the last period, what was the phase of the moon, et cetera, incredibly elaborate. And people have tested it. They're no better than chance. In fact, if you want to guess the sex of thousands of births, your best guess, you're going to get the highest hit rate if you guess always male, because then you get to 51%. And all those calendar methods, et cetera, they don't do that well. They can't predict that well. Okay, questions? I think it's time to Kahoot. So now we have a little more information about ways to sexually reproduce. If you're an aquatic species, you can sexually reproduce by just sending your gametes out there. And so that's external fertilization. But in some aquatic species, there's internal fertilization, where rather than sending the gametes out there into the world, the male delivers the gametes directly to the female, and fertilization happens inside her body. And there are loads of amphibians and fish where this is the way things are done. Now, there are plenty of fish and amphibians that just send their gametes out there, but there are also some fish that use internal fertilization, where the father makes sperm and arranges through mating behavior to get those sperm close enough to her outlet that they can work their way upstream. And in many of those cases, the female then lets the eggs develop inside her body out of way of danger for a while, and then lays the fertilized eggs. And in that case, that's known as oviparity, where she lays the eggs, they go out into the environment, and she may even tend them for a while, or maybe they're on their own, but eventually they finish their development outside her body. There are other fish that show viviparity, where The fertilized egg stays inside the female's body and hatches inside the female's body. And when enough of the eggs have hatched, she squeezes out live offspring. And so that's viviparity. In mammals, this whole business of mom holding on to the offspring to give them a boost in life has gone to incredible, unbelievable extremes. So not only is the egg fertilized inside mom's body, not only does it hatch inside her body, but it continues to grow inside there. And she will pour enormous amounts of resources into that offspring before it ever comes out into the world. And mammals, and by the way, that is something that birds do too. So among birds and mammals, it's very common for the individuals to be pretty well developed and huge when they come out into the world, either because the egg hatched or because mom squeezed the individuals out. But then mammals take it up a notch. And not only do they develop the offspring inside them until they're very well developed when they get pushed out, but then they'll start making food for them for lactation. You don't think of birds. Birds don't lactate. They don't have mammary glands. But for most bird species too, after the egg hatches, mom has to spend a lot of energy gathering food and stuffing it down their mouths. And in most bird species, there's no chance of the offspring to survive unless both parents are gathering food and pushing it down the chick's mouth, which is why you'll sometimes see a male cardinal being harassed by a cowbird that's begging for food, and poor male cardinal can't help himself. That's the begging call. That's the look. I got to get something and shove it down there. I got to grab a bug, stick it down there right away. Bless you. And the point is that this mode of reproduction that mammals undergo, it's incredibly expensive for the females in terms of resources like nutrients and minerals and stuff like that. So that you have a situation, I'm going to pop ahead a little bit, where the female's contribution is just enormous. So look here. All of this biomass that you see in front of you, every bit of it, mom came up with all of it. She ate and metabolized enough food to make all of this biomass you see in front of you, because the pups can't eat solid food yet. So it's just, notice that put together, it's bigger than her, and then some, right? What did dad contribute? At most, a teaspoon of material, concentrated in DNA, in sperm, but pretty trivial. So this disparity in parental contribution reaches its absolute extreme in the mammals, where females are going to have to expend a lot more effort, gather a lot more resources in order to reproduce. How's that? Okay, when we come back next week, we'll talk about evolution some more, and then we'll break into our study groups so that you can get to know the other people in your reading pod on perusal. Yes.
When I was